Today we're going to be painting this painting right here. It is essentially a summer version of a painting I've done in the past. There's a spring version, a fall version, and it's really quite fun to play with the different seasons of varying painting. If there's a lesson on the channel that you really like and you'd like to see in a different season, let me know. I'm happy to do that sort of thing. Also worth noting, if you want the digital sketch with this lesson to help you with the drawing process, that is up and available over on Patreon, along with all of these hour-long lessons, as well as royalty-free reference photos and all of that. So if you're interested in that or just supporting the channel, check it out, link in the description. All of that being said, let's jump into today's video. Going to begin here by taking my larger square-headed brush, dipping it in some water, that way it's damp, that way I can kind of glide my paint across the canvas a little bit easier, grab some titanium white paint, and begin applying that to the entirety of the sky. Now I can still see my drawing through this background because I did that drawing with a fine tip Sharpie, and it lets me see through the first couple of layers, which is great because now I don't have to redraw on everything. Speaking of drawing, if you'd like the digital sketch of this to help you with the drawing process, that is up over on Patreon. So there's a link to that in the description. That said, we're just about done applying the titanium white to our sky, and now I can begin mixing some actual color. I'm going to take some of this primary yellow, move that down here on my palette, grab a good amount of titanium white, mix those two together. It's going to desaturate and brighten the primary yellow, and then I'm going to apply that to the top of my sky, as you can see here. I'm going to fill in the little areas of my tree, and then I'm going to blend downwards in horizontal strokes. I'm trying to get it so it's a little bit brighter down here and a little bit more of that saturated yellow at the top. This is just going to create some depth in the painting. There we go. Going to clean off my brush, grab a little bit more water, a little bit more paint, and then that should be worked down into the bottom for the reflection. Using the larger square-headed brush because it holds the most amount of paint, and it lets me get this down quite quickly so I can blend the yellow in with the white. There we go. Cleaning my brush, that way it doesn't kind of condense with acrylic paint and ruin it, and good as new. Now I'm going to switch over to an older square-headed brush, one where the bristles leaf off in varying directions. You can make one of these very simply by just peeling back the bristles on your brush, as I'm doing right here, until you get something that looks a little disheveled. Now I'm going to work on the tree line in the background. So I'm going to take some of my primary yellow, I'm going to take a hint, just a hint, of Mars Black, and mix those two together. It's going to make a green. Now you can also make green with primary yellow and primary blue, but that'll be a much more lush green, it'll have more saturation, and this is in the background, so I want it to be a little bit more muted. I'm going to test my color down here, decide that I do like that, I like that quite a bit, and so now I'm going to move it up to the tops of my trees here. Now it's going to blend a little bit with the white that overlapped our trees, and that isn't a bad thing. It's just going to make it look much more cohesive. Here I'm going back, I'm mixing more, this time with a little bit of additional yellow, just kind of fixing it up until I get the exact color that I want. Then I'm dabbing on all of my foliage, or rather the implication of my foliage. Grabbing a little bit more of that Mars Black, tapping that in there, and just building up our layers here. Now the tops of the trees need to be the brightest because they're going to be catching the most light. The light is coming from behind the set of trees, so the tops of them are getting a lot of light. The bottom area, it's going to be a lot darker, and we can make that darker fairly soon with the implementation of a little bit more Mars Black. If you don't use enough Mars Black, you'll get more of a yellow, but that's okay, we can go back in. Here I have more Mars Black on my brush, and as you can see, now when I do this tapping motion, I get more of a green, and I can build a little bit more depth. There we go. If it's a little bit too dark, we grab some extra yellow and just begin blending that back up. But not blending in the conventional or in the conventional sense, doing my blending in this tapping motion, as you can see here. Continuously going back and mixing more of my color. Didn't want to mix too much at the start just in case it wasn't exactly what I wanted. Instead, I figured I'd slowly build up to it, and having to remix the paint a number of times will be good practice and make us all stronger painters. So by no means is it a bad thing. Now I'm not using a lot of very dark pigments here. I'm going to save that for my tree in the foreground, but I will now move down to this area after I let my cat out of the room. I think it's time for his lunch. We are now back and are going to continue with this older square-headed brush. So, I'm going to continue mixing more of this color for the reflection. I'm going to take some of that primary yellow, mix that in there, and I'm going to do a bit of a tapping motion just to begin. We have our line which essentially separates our land from the reflection in the water, and I'm going to do a couple of additional tricks to make this reflection look like it is actually a reflection and distinguish it from this back area. But first, I want to put in a little bit of texture and then we can distort it afterwards. So I'm grabbing a little bit more of that Mars black, darkening the reflection at the bottom here, moving it downwards, as you can see. Should still blend, in the very least optically, with the layer underneath, regardless of if it is dry or not. There we go. I'm going to grab a little bit more of that primary yellow now that we're getting to the bottom of the reflection where the trees are at their brightest. We can throw that in as well. Make it look like that highlight is really reflecting. I like that a lot. Now, I generally don't wet this brush because if you do, the bristles kind of condense inwards and you can't make all of these fine little applications. But I'm not going to use a tapping motion with it for a little while, so here I'm going to clean off that paint, as you can see. Wipe off my brush, and then I'm going to do a little bit of a drag in a couple of areas. This is going to make it look like the water is moving. It's going to distort the reflection of the texture a little bit, and it's going to give us good distinction between our two subjects here. So that's essentially what that's going to look like if we are quite subtle with it. We could really drag it out and make big change like this as well. Just want to show you a couple options. Or of course, if you don't like that, you can just move back in all of that texture that we had worked in right beforehand. So yet again, I'm going to clean this brush because I'm done with it for the time being, and we don't want the paint to dry on the brush. Otherwise, it will be ruined. Now I'm going to switch to a smaller, round-headed brush. I'm going to dip that in some water, grab some primary yellow, a little bit of titanium white paint. I'm just going to add a couple of little highlights, tapping onto our trees here in the background. Just where the light's really going to catch it. This is just a little detail that can do a lot for the piece. There we go. In the distance, you can hear the serene sound of cell phone. There we go. Like that a lot. Just separating different trees and creating different clusters and trying to make it all nice and interesting. Now, I'm going to let this dry for a second, come back and begin working on our foreground. It's been a couple of minutes and now my older square-headed brush is nice and dry, so I can begin to apply all of those sharp little applications again. Now I'm going to begin working on the foliage here in the foreground. I'm going to start with the darkest layer, then add midtones and highlights. Depth is created when you wrap light around a subject, so here we have our highlight, our midtone, and our dark tone, and that makes it look like the light's just moving its way on top. We're going to do that with our foreground, but we're going to really stress it so that it looks like it's popping out and it's so much closer to us. So with all of that said, let's start here by grabbing some Mars Black, some of our primary yellow. I'm going to grab a hint of primary blue as well because I want this green to be a little bit more saturated. The farther things are away in our painting, the more of the atmospheric color they are going to get. So you'll see much more of that yellow from the sky in them. And then as we get closer to us in the foreground, we get more of the innate coloring, which is that of the tree and its foliage. So here we have a little bit more of a true green rather than that yellow green that we have in the background. So I'm just tapping this on. I can still see my drawing through the paint because I did use that fine tip Sharpie to create it. However, if you can't, don't you worry about it. You can go back to the start of the video. You can see it, you can re-sketch it on, or of course you can use the digital sketch if you are a supporter over on Patreon. So here I'm just working my way throughout the tree, leaving little openings and making sure we have all of this applied where we want it. I just about ran out of paint there, so I'm going to grab some more of everything, remix that right where I was before, and then get back to it. I'm trying to apply my initial applications in the middle of the foliage. Then as I run out of paint on my brush, I get towards the outskirts of the patches. That way it's a little bit more clear because there isn't as much paint on the brush. You can see the white and the yellow of the canvas showing through, and you automatically get this little bit of a highlighted effect. It's very subtle, but it's good to play with as you get an idea of where to put your midtones and your highlights. So again, I just grabbed fresh paint. I'm putting it in a very dense area that's not going to be receiving much light. And then I work that out and around the openings of my tree. Yet again, I've run out of paint, so I'm going to mix more. Not a frustrating process, it's just making us all better painters. I'm also slightly avoiding branches at this point, just because I've added so much paint that here we can start to lose the drawn on Sharpie. And while I can go back and redraw it, I don't really have to, so might as well work the way I am. Now I'm going to take more of that and apply it to the grass that we have down here. Just like that, same way. At this point the grass is still far enough away that you won't see the detail, and it'll kind of blend in with the bushes and everything else that we have down here. You can also use that horizontal stroke for the reflection, just as we did before. Then there's that little bit of the tree over here that we still need to fill in. Now I'm going to add a little bit of water to this, not too much, and I'm going to do some horizontal strokes for the reflection. I'm not doing too many at the start, being very delicate with it. Just making sure I have what I want. There we go. If we want to go back and touch it up later, we can, but now it's time for our midtones. So I'm going to dry this off very well. Grab some of this primary yellow, put it over here, grab a little bit of primary blue, move it over there, tiny bit of Mars black, that way we're consistent with our color palette, and a hint of our titanium white as well. It's a little desaturated, so I'll throw a little bit more yellow into it. Then I'll head to the edges of my tree, the areas that are going to be receiving the most light, the thinnest area of foliage where light can pass through, and I'm going to start tapping on these applications. There we go. It's very subtle at this point. I have a lot of pigment on my brush, so I'm washing that off yet again. Going back to my palette, grab a little bit more yellow this time, and build up from there. You can see this mixture has much more of a contrast than the initial one and stands out quite well. So we'll continue considering moving forward with that instead. There we go. Remember, this is reserved for the thin areas of foliage and the foliage on the outskirts of the tree. You can also apply a hint of it down into the bushes below and in our reflection. From there, we're going to take even more primary yellow, a little bit more titanium white, and build that up. Then on the edges, we can add that nice gold highlight that the light in the background is providing to everything else. Rotating my brush slightly as I move around the tree, just to make it interesting. Make sure that each application is a little bit different from the one next to it, and that our tree is always evolving. Adding a little bit of detail into the middle area as well. Going back to my palette, grabbing some really, really bright tones, now comparable to that, and I'll just do some slight edging, allow some foliage to leaf off from the tree in interesting new ways, create a little added piece there, bring some life back into this middle area. You get that real contrast when you have a very dark color next to a very light color. That's when it'll stand out to the greatest degree. There we go. Now I'm going to clean my brush. Grab some burnt umber, apply that to my palette, take a smaller square-headed brush, grab some brown, grab some Mars black, a little bit of titanium white, mix that right here at the bottom of my palette, create a nice dark, thick brown, and start to draw in the tree itself. I can still see most of the lines in my tree, and when they're very small, I'm going in at a bit of a tapping motion instead of a drag, because it's going to allow me to keep my application much more sharp and thick than the dragging process would. So when you're making your lines, consider the best application style. When you do a drag, you can get things very consistent,
and very clean on the edges, but you can get a thin application. With this tapping motion, I get something that's a little different. It can be a bit textured, but it's much more thick to begin. And in addition to that, I get this nice bark-like edging that's a little bit different. Going to make up a little bit of stuff here. Just have some fun with it. Staying creative. There we are. Going back to my palette. Going to grab some of that burnt umber, a little bit of titanium white, mix up a very bright brown. I'm going to apply this with a tapping motion to the edges of the bark that are receiving light. It will probably blend at this point with the initial layer because it's still quite wet, but it will create a difference between the dark tone and the highlight, and thus render depth. Depth is actually quite easy to do in painting. You just need your highlighted tone, your mid-tone, and your dark tone. And the blend here is helping me create all of them. We're not outlining all of it. Some areas won't be receiving light because there simply will be too much shadow around them, but I can patch in a little areas where light might be kind of leaking in. There we are. Now, of course, we are not done. We still need to do the reflections down here. And I'm not going to add as much detail into these because I don't want them to take away from the actual subject, but we'll do a little bit like that. There we go. Now to give it a little bit of additional life, I'm going to take my smaller round-headed brush, dip that in water, grab a little bit of Mars black paint, work in a couple of flying birds in the background. I'm going to do them in a set of 3. They're not flying in the same line, flying about, and it just gives it this added little piece of life. Then I'm going to switch back to the smaller square-headed brush, grab a little bit of titanium white paint, a hint of primary yellow, mix those two together, create some lines of water separating the land, and I'm going to drag those out over some of our applications. Try to keep my hand out of the shot, but it's very delicate and it's a small painting. So you'll have to forgive me if I'm occasionally in the way. But this is just going to give it that added effect of water. I wanted to wait till the end to see how much we could do detail-wise. Trying to keep them fairly straight and quite small as well. You can throw it around the back of the painting if you want. Just like this. There we go. And if you find that you want a little more saturation in the sky or somewhere else, you can always take your medium-sized, larger or smaller square-headed brush, grab some extra titanium white, some extra primary yellow, and rework that saturation into the top for a bit of a bolder painting. I'm going to be very careful around this bird right now. Just create this slight vignette effect. There we go. Now my brush has almost no paint on it, just water, and it's going to help me blend my new wet paint into my pre-existing dry paint. The bird is just about dry at this point, so I can now go over portions of it without worrying about it blending into the sky. Have to make sure your bird is dry to do that though. There we go. By the way, we have a lot of green in this tree, but not much in that back area. If you felt so inclined, you could take a little bit of that pigment and work it back there as well. Just using that same old square-headed brush. As you can see, it can kind of tie the two pieces together and it makes them look a little bit closer together as well, which really isn't a bad thing. But if you want the maximum amount of depth, I would try to keep the background more yellow and the foreground more green. But again, if you want it to be a little more cohesive, you can throw that green in just as I am right now and connect things a little bit more.
So there we have it. That is today's 30-ish minute lesson. Let me know what you think of the new format, seeing the palette in the shots as well as the water. I think it could be a fun addition to the channel. Also worth noting, if you're new to painting and you'd simply like to learn more, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. In it we talk about how to mix with water, how to mix your paints, all of the things you need to know before you jump into your first painting. Also worth noting, you can find all of these hour-long lessons up over on Patreon. There are dozens more, but it's a good time. It's fun, it's relaxing, it's calming, it's a great hobby, and there's plenty of lessons up there. So go check it out, link in the description. I will see you soon with another video, and above all, as always, stay creative.